Well, hello, everyone. I'm very excited to be with you again today, and it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Professor Jeremy Bailenson. To say that Jeremy is a leading authority on how VR and AR systems impact human perception and behavior is an understatement. He is the leading authority, in my opinion. And Jeremy, I think you get the award for best book title. Your book, Experience on Demand, I think is a great way to describe for the general public what VR is all about. So glad we have a chance to talk today.
Walter, if I could be interviewed by anybody, it would be you. So I'm thrilled to get the chance to share the stage with you, and always time well spent hearing your thoughts on VR as well. So thanks for having me. Thanks to Games for Change for throwing this conference, and super excited to talk to you for half an hour.
Fantastic. Well, maybe a good way for us to start is for us to have you tell us briefly your origin story. How did you get involved in VR, and how long have you been involved? And I think more importantly, Jeremy, I'd love to hear what you're passionate about. What drives you?
Well, there's a lot there to unpack. My origin story, my PhD was in cognitive science. In 1999, I was building models of how the brain works, running experiments on humans to understand how they formed categories, made decisions, and then building low-level AI models to try to capture those mechanisms. And I realized in 99 that I just didn't want to be doing that. Cog sci was great, but it just wasn't my calling. And before leaving academia, I was inspired. I read a novel called Neuromancer, and Neuromancer, who many of you have likely read. It's a mind-blowing novel written about the possibilities of augmented and virtual reality and how avatars are going to change the human condition. And that book inspired me to apply for a postdoc at UC Santa Barbara, where at UCSB I learned how to build hardware systems to program VR content, and at the same time to ask questions that were more about the human condition, about communication, about education, about training, about well-being, as opposed to the structure of the brain. And I spent 4 years at UC Santa Barbara working with the great Jim Blaskovich and the great Jack Loomis, and was lucky enough in 2003 to get a job in Stanford's Department of Communication, where for the last 19 years I've been running the Virtual Human Interaction Lab, where we study VR, AR, we study the technical aspects, we study the psychology of it, how it affects the brain. And in the last 7 or 8 years, we've been really active in interfacing with companies and organizations and governments to help them figure out how they can use VR.
Well, and of course, the Stanford Virtual Human Interaction Lab, 19 years, that's incredible. I hadn't realized it goes by fast, doesn't it?
It goes by fast. It goes by fast.
But maybe you could tell us a little bit about how people can visit the Stanford Virtual Human Interaction Lab through one of the recent releases you've done of a virtual system.
Yeah, thanks for that, Walter. So since 2003, we've been running lab tours. So anyone that has a VR system, that one of the joys of VR is being able to show it to others and to give people demos. And we've been giving the lab tours fairly regularly. In 2010, we institutionalized it. So it didn't matter who you were. At 4 p.m., if you showed up at the lab and you were one of the first 30 people, you would come in the lab on 4 p.m. on Friday. And what would happen is that I would give each person one demo. You could either be walking the plank or flying like Superwoman, or you could be cutting down a tree to learn about deforestation. You could be changing identity in the mirror so that you change your skin color or your gender, and you'd go through all the different lab demos that are representative of our science. And over the last 19 years, we've had over 15,000 visitors come and visit the lab. After 3 years of a nonstop labor, including it becoming one of my COVID obsessions because there's nothing to do but stay home and code, we've just released for free to the world a piece called Virtual Becomes Reality. It's on Steam right now. It's you need a PC to run it because it's a bit intensive processing, but if you do have a standalone VR like the Quest 2 and you want to plug it to your PC with the link, it works. It's a 15-minute self-contained lab tour where you are greeted by a hologram of me, and I take you through all of our science, and you get to grow a third arm and do all the experiments that my lab is famous for. You can now do them at home, and it's free. And it's again, we've been working working on it nonstop for 3 years. It premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival in April 2020, but of course the festival was online only then. But Walter, it's been a labor of love, and I'm just thrilled that it's it's out there now and anyone can download it. So please, all of our listeners, I would love for you to download it for free and to play with it.
Virtual becomes reality. Such a major contribution. The other information we should give the people who are joining us today is the URL for the Stanford VR Lab, which is very simple. It's stanfordvr.com. But there's a few tabs that will take you to your academic publications and other information.
Yes, we like to share our stuff, so everything on it is free, and we hope you come and read and watch.
Jeremy, you've had a focus on how VR and AR can impact in education, environmental conservation, empathy, and health. I'm curious, what is, I guess, at the top of your mind right now in terms of the way emerging immersive environments can have a positive impact on our health and on society? I know that I'm asking a lot here, but I'm wondering what your initial reaction is to that, and what first comes to mind when I bring up those important topics?
Yeah, well, look, this is obviously the right group of people to talk to about this topic. So, my daughters, who you didn't see, they just actually snuck under the camera to go into their Nana's room. I'm in New York at my mom's house. And my daughters, when I told them about this talk I'm giving today, I said, I'm talking to people that make the video games that I actually let you guys play, right? And so this is the right group to talk about that. We think, there's currently a huge push for VR for diversity training, and you're seeing a lot of good startups in the space, as well as larger companies getting involved. Of course, Walter, my passion on climate change, getting people to viscerally understand the connection between their day-to-day actions and how it affects remote places, things that are invisible, like CO2 molecules, which you don't get to see in the real world. And there's so many areas where we can, leverage the experiential aspect of VR to not magically change one's mindset. It's not as if a 10-minute experience in VR is going to forever change the way you think about race relations. However, it gives you an experience that allows you to reframe, and it just changes the conversation. And my language over the years has evolved as I think about the pro-social aspects of VR. And we need to be careful. No media experience magically changes everything about how we feel. But it does give us an experience, and it gives us a way to bootstrap into action and conversations that are just a little bit different based on that experience.
Yeah, it provides the scaffolding and provides a way to think about these issues. The other amazing thing that you're doing this summer is teaching a class in virtual reality.
Yeah, this is, I've been teaching a class called Virtual People since 2003, and a version like it since 99. And I've always taught about VR, using PowerPoint, right? And it was the only way to do it. There's always been a splash of VR involved. For example, the students would take a field trip to my lab, but what we're doing now is we have 102 students. Every single student has their own standalone VR headset. Most of them using the Oculus Quest 2, and we are running a class inside VR. Now, what we're not doing is we're not lecturing in VR, because I think actually Zoom is a better medium for simply a professor lecturing. But what we've come up with is a series of experiences that's very active and collaborative in VR. And over the course of the quarter, each week they're doing a different experience that shows organically how VR can help them, attack some problems. So for example, in the week on medical VR, Walter, which I know is a passion of yours, we're doing a couple things, including we're going to have 100 people all go to AltSpace VR and sit down in a meditation class, and we're going to meditate together. One of the neatest parts of the class is we have 102 students, and we have roughly 8 discussion sections. And once a week, all in groups of 10 or 12, the students converge. We use the Engage platform, which has been an amazing, utterly mind-blowingly great tool for teaching and learning. So appreciative to the Engage folks who have been helping us run this class. And what we're doing is we're having a conversation where spatial relations are brought back to conversations, right? So on Zoom, as we know, if I look to the left, it doesn't mean I'm looking at you, Walter. It means I'm looking off screen. And we have all these kind of confusing nonverbal cues because of the lack of spatial aspects, and we have people standing in a group, and they're talking to each other and they're gesturing in a way where they see each other's gestures, and we're bringing the conversation back into teaching and experimenting with it. So it's we're in week we're just finishing up week 4 of the class, and it's just been incredible. I mean, for me, a personal moment of teaching history, I had 100 Stanford students all networked into VR at once, and we were in the Engage platform playing around with our avatars. And in addition to it just being an awesome pedagogical thing for VR, a class about VR, you got to think this is COVID, and we haven't been in a big group before, and you had all these students, shaking hands and being in a group of, it just felt great. So it's super fun.
Oh, that is so amazing, and I know it's just as you said, it's been impactful on you. I'm sure it's been impactful on your students. And talk about experiential learning. This is fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, the key is to not use VR for what we're doing now, because it turns out Zoom works really great for me speaking and with words and you listening, and we're trying to use VR for things that are experiential and for actually doing things.
The other thing you mentioned, the title of the class was Virtual Humans, and I'm very excited about the work that you've done in terms of leveraging the concept of the future self to help motivate people, engage people in looking after their own health, for example, or their financial security. As you know, one of the big challenges we have in any digital app that's designed for promoting better healthcare, for example, is adherence, having people have a reason to come back. And I think you've shown through your research that by connecting people with their future self, and there's a process that you go through to make that connection, it can motivate people to change their behavior, which is actually pretty astonishing.
Yeah, one of the coolest thing about VR is that time becomes fluid, and you can see the future. You can see yourself in the future. You can see a version of your future self that adhered to whatever plan you have, be it financial, food, exercise, and you can see what happens if you don't do that over time. And over the years, we've looked at exercise behavior, eating behavior, financial savings, and there's nothing more powerful, or few things more powerful than seeing one's future self 30 years from now that has been changed because of you doing X versus Y. And it's a really neat tool for people to kind of choose their own plan and then to see what happens if they stick to it.
Yeah. So important, so exciting. I'm also very excited by what you're doing outside of the ivory tower, outside of academia. Can you tell us a little bit more about your activities with Striver?
Yeah, so Striver is a company that I co-founded with my graduate student, Derek Belch, and Derek was a football player. And in 2013, his thesis was using 360 video to capture plays on the field that then quarterbacks would put on the headset, and they would practice decision making when they weren't on the field. So they would put on the goggles and they would see a defensive formation. They'd look around, the play would unfold, and they would figure out if they would have changed the play at the line of scrimmage. And the entire master's thesis work was all about mental decision making, putting you in a situation that was arousing in VR, all these players coming at you. Sometimes that was rare, could be a formation that you wouldn't see often, or a ball that gets fumbled, etc. And then having you, practice, get acclimated to that scene and that context, and then making better mental decisions. And one of the teams we were training was the Arkansas Razorbacks. And in Arkansas, there's this little company called Walmart. And the head of training from Walmart came one day to the football office and put on the goggles, did the football demos, and said, what you're doing there is showing a visual pattern, having someone make a decision based on that contextual pattern. They then have to communicate that decision to others is basically what every Walmart employee does every day. And so what began a couple of years ago, about 2017 or 2016, excuse me, was the foray from sports. So Striver done all this work with sports, with U.S. Olympic skiing, the German national soccer team, the NBA, the NFL, from sports to enterprise. And we started working with companies like Walmart and FedEx and Nationwide and Chipotle, and you can go down the list. But there's so many contexts where, as an employee, if you want to train, VR is by far the best way to do it. For example, at Walmart, they've got something called Holiday Rush. It's the day after Thanksgiving, and it's an utter cacophony. There's people everywhere, all around you, and they're pushing and shoving and yelling sometimes. And because of turnover, only 1 in 2 Walmart employees has actually ever seen Holiday Rush. And so, as a great tool to get them onboarded and ramped up for that. And we could go through dozens of examples, Walter, but for me, as a guy who's been doing VR for 20 years, Striver has trained, in the last 18 months, we've trained over 1 million people in VR,
Wow.
right? And these are just numbers that you don't get, obviously, in academia, and are hard to get in other places. And it's been just utterly fascinating to watch, to really think about scale. And when you think about scale and accessibility and how to make VR work for, we installed 3 or 4 VR training systems in every one of Walmart's 4,700 stores in the United States. And how do you manage scale like that? And so it's been super fascinating to watch, and it's been fun.
Well, and also a major contribution to move VR forward. I think that one of the things that will help us start seeing VR used more often in appropriate ways is having it move over to the enterprise, to the business zone.
Yeah.
And Walmart is a fantastic starting point, and $1 million, that's amazing.
One of my favorite new use cases, Walter, I haven't talked about this with you. So Sprouts, which is a farmer's market chain where they sell, great food and other things. But part of Sprouts' business model is their brand of the customer experience, and they wanted to train their employees on the culture of Sprouts, right? The people that work at Sprouts, they're proud of their culture, and part of their training is to get them, to feel what it's like to be a Sprouts employee. And we created these VR demos that were designed. We use something in psychology called the exemplar model. Instead of giving somebody rules, so previously Sprouts was using a PowerPoint presentation. What we created was a series of 12 experiences that were typical of, what sets Sprouts apart from different places. So a mother comes in and she's upset because she just found out that her son needs to be gluten-free, and then an employee comes over and kind of takes them through some recipes and goes that extra mile. Or somebody who's a regular comes in and the employee notices that their father isn't with them, and they typically are. And what ensues is finding the favorite food from the father. And it's just a series of specific examples that typify a culture. So one of the hardest things to do in general is to train culture, and particularly during COVID. And what Sprouts showed was much more efficient and effective cultural training using VR than in other areas. And so the reason I bring this up, Walter, is that there's a lot of work in general in the history of VR on procedural training, how to train someone to fly a plane or to be a surgeon. It's really nice to start seeing these more kind of social, contextual, emotional type applications. And the cool thing about the enterprise is I never would have thought of training a culture by having people experience a lot of different examples. And by working with companies, you kind of find these nuggets, and it's been super fun.
Oh, that's amazing. I know that your background and predilection as a scientist has probably propelled you towards measuring the impact of these training experiences and how long they persist and do the actual work. And I think that if you can talk about that briefly, I think that would be of great interest to our audience, because there's so much emphasis put on the value of VR for training scenarios like you described, but not many people take the trouble to actually demonstrate it.
Yeah, so I can talk about Striver, but let me pivot back to my lab for a second, because my lab's been running experiments where we measured the impact of VR for quite some time. What's changed for the lab in the last few years is we are looking at 3 things that are different. Number one, we're looking at large samples. So we're now publishing studies where we have 1,000 plus people go through VR as opposed to a couple dozen. Number two, we're looking at samples of people who are not college students. So we are getting, not just use what psychologists call convenience samples, but actually going out and getting good variance in age and socioeconomic status and demographics, et cetera. The third thing that we're doing is we're looking at time. So time in two ways. You can look at the number of doses one takes, how many times they go into VR and come back. So for example, with going back to NFL quarterbacks, we created a really nice regimen where they would go in, they didn't need to go in for an hour, like 4 or 5 minutes. It turns out that, as you know, the neuroscience of learning, lots of small doses that are spaced out is much better than longer doses. And so coming up with the right regimens to have lots of doses, and then looking at the longer term effects, looking at do the impacts of VR training last 3 months, 6 months, a year later, and really starting to collect that data. Going back to Striver, one of the cool things about working with corporate partners is that you get to tie VR training performance with subsequent promotions or evaluations on the job 6 months later, a year later, because most companies have quarterly reports where people assess themselves and are assessed by their bosses. You actually can see the downstream effects of VR training with over time. And because these companies are investing fairly large budgets into their VR training, they actually want to know the answer of the return on investment, and we're getting really nice numbers and really rigorous studies on it.
Well, I imagine that employee safety records and absenteeism and issues like that are also probably a big part of the analytics that are possible with that sort of paradigm. Now this might be a controversial topic, but let's jump into it. I've heard very often people describe VR as an empathy machine. And that, but I know it's not as simple as people make it out to be. Can you elaborate a little bit on your perspective and what your research has indicated?
Yeah, so there's no media experience that's going to magically change who you are and how you think. And despite all of us have been guilty of a bit of hyperbole, all of us being the VR folks have been doing this for a few decades, and it happens, and I'm just as guilty as the next party here. What our research has shown us over the years is that in terms of empathy, one thing VR does is it helps those take the perspective of others when they are not good at that. So it turns out there are individual differences in one's ability to take the perspective of others. So if I say, Walter, imagine what it's like to be this person during this time, some people are better at that imagination process than others. And what our research shows across studies is that for people who have a hard time in general taking the perspective of others, VR provides unique benefits to them. The other thing I like about VR is simply giving you extra mental repetitions. And there's been a lot of narrative, some of it for me, about VR can change bias. It can change, the implicit association task. And there's some data on that, and those scholars doing that work, including myself. I'm happy that we're doing it. But I think that in general, the true value of VR on these diversity topics is just giving you practice, right? So if you think about the flight simulator, we have the flight simulator because VR is about doing, failing, getting feedback, and repeating. So when humans are learning in the most wonderful constructivist context, you're out and you're doing stuff, you make mistakes, you get constructive feedback, you repeat, and you get better. And so for me, when it comes to things like sexual harassment training and training around race issues, we like to build simulations in the lab where, I know it sounds strange, but the point of you engaging in this conversation with someone, or the scenario is we actually want you to make a mistake, because that's what VR is for, is allowing you to learn from your own behavior. And so I like VR as not as a magic tool to solve all the world's problems around empathy, but as a way to get us to practice. And the one thing I will say, so we've on my lab's website, we've posted for free 1,000 Cut Journey, which is a Courtney Cogburn's piece that we worked on her with about Black-white racism, where you become Michael Sterling and experience racial bias as a kindergartner, as a teenager, and as an adult. We've got Becoming Homeless, where you learn that the plight of homeless people is not only because of who they are, but about the situation that can cause that. And we've got a few others as well. They're free to download. The one thing I will say is that when we think about how to bring 1,000 Cut Journey into diversity training, what we do is we incorporate it into, say, a day-long curriculum, and we use it as a way to change the conversation. So the VR piece, 15 minutes of your life. It's not the training, but it is an experience that then changes the way that you are going to engage with the subsequent conversation, with the subsequent materials. And in that instance, I like to think of it as a lightning rod that kind of increases arousal that then just, changes the way the day goes from there on out.
Yeah. Well, and it brings it back once more to the theme of VR as generating experiences and learning from experiences. And it also reminds me of one of the mantras in Silicon Valley, which is fail often, fail fast, that you do learn by your experiences, and VR does give us the ability to replicate and also to up the challenge dynamically using a game heuristic paradigm, which I think is so important. And Jeremy, you made me think when you were talking about the rush day at Walmart for training the employees. I think it might be good for shoppers to have some stress inoculation too. If they're about to wade into that complex situation, they can practice and be prepared for it too. We only have a few more minutes, but why don't you tell us some of the things that you're extremely curious about right now? What you have had 20 years worth of working in VR and exploring different topics. You've got some ongoing projects right now, but what are some of the unanswered questions that you're trying to unravel and address?
Yeah, so I think I'll go in two directions there. The first thing that I'm, as we emerge from COVID and I go back to my physical lab, one thing that we've been working on, and others have been working on this too, is basically a mechanical Turk for VR. So if I want to collect a bunch of data about a VR experience, how can I leverage the fact that a lot of people have VR at home and build an infrastructure where I can collect data at scale by using the cloud? And there's been a lot of nice projects that are doing that. We've been doing a lot of work there. And so one of the things that I'm trying to figure out is how I can collect data, not physically at my lab, but at scale in the world. Obviously, this relates to what I talked about earlier with the size of samples and also the diversity of samples if you can get into more places. On the other hand, I'm thinking about the physical lab because I still want the physical lab to be a special place. For those who have visited, we've got a floor that shakes, that bounces you around, and we have a 24-channel ambisonic sound system that can spatialize sound so they move around you. We are incorporating a number of different haptic devices. We've been working with OVR on incorporating scent into our demos, and I'm really thinking hard about how can I still make the lab a very special place to give you an experience. Again, we like to push the boundaries and run new types of studies. So I'm thinking about scale, and I'm also thinking about in the lab how to make it a place that is unique and different.
Fantastic. And we've been using the term VR through our discussion over the last 30 minutes. I suspect that you also have some really exciting work where you're looking at augmented reality too.
Yeah, quickly, in the 50 seconds we have left, I will point readers or listeners to my website, and there's two things I'd like you to look at. One is a system built by Hansel June called Telespace, which is a free system that basically goes from the Microsoft Kinect or any infrared camera directly into something like the HoloLens, then can actually beam in holograms of people as a social interaction tool. The second is an academic paper I wrote about the dangers of such a system that Mark Miller was lead author on. It's called Social Interaction in Augmented Reality, published in 2019 in the journal PLOS ONE, where we run a bunch of experiments, which is how does the human condition change when I'm walking around wearing augmented reality glasses and I'm basically seeing ghosts. And I'm walking around in the street and there's ghosts in my field of view and they're not in your field of view. And how does the world change when the ground truth of the number of people present in a scene is no longer held constant and there's no common ground? And so really important.
Fantastic. And Jeremy, I love the fact that you just assigned us some homework to do. Okay, everyone, I'm sure you have questions. Jeremy and I are going to go to the Spark zone for question and answers. There's a link to that in the chat window if you don't have the link already, and we'll meet you there and take on some questions. Jeremy, thank you so much for your important work and for being with us today.
Always a pleasure, Walter. Thank you.